Thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Valentine's is just around the corner, and many of us may find ourselves flying solo wondering, why can't I have that special someone in my life? I'd like to give somebody a nice special gift, but apparently as I look in the mirror, I might be the only one that I'm giving that to. Why is it that as we see ourselves single in certain situations, such as Valentine's Day, that we find ourselves asking that question, why can't I find that person that can be with me where I can share my life, my dreams, possibilities, even a lot of fun to go along with it? Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today, our special guest works as an international life coach, counselor, teacher, healer, minister, and she also authors a wonderful book called The Attraction Distraction. She joined us here on the program before as she founded Success for the Soul in 1996 to talk about how we can place our intentions in the right frame of mind to be able to get what it is that we're looking for. Today we're going to be talking about what it takes to create and sustain fulfilling relationships. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Miss Sonia Miller. Sonia, thank you for joining us here on the program.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
You bet. Now, Valentine's Day and sustaining fulfilling relationships. The thing that I take a look at Valentine's Day, it seems to be one of those days where, this is the day that I'm going to treat my loved ones special. And I think to myself, well, what about the other 364 days out of the year? What's going on with this?
Well, I think it's kind of the squeaky wheel gets oiled, and so I think what happens for a lot of people is we get into our ruts and our routines, and we forget that maybe relationships are an opportunity for growth, an opportunity to bring our best and experience our best, but that takes attention. Mm-hmm. And so something like a national holiday brings our attention to it, but then we do tend to kind of get a little bit relaxed the other 364 days of the year. Not all of us, but I think that's what happens in regard to your question.
Now, taking a look at your body of work, you're approaching close to 20 years. We're taking a look at this here.
Yeah.
And, because you've worked with people for such a long period of time, and I'm sure it's even been beyond that, because that's when you actually founded Success for the Soul, what do you see what seems to be the number one motivator that people look for when it comes to relationships? Is there a potpourri of things, or are there expectations that people are looking to perhaps fill the voids they have in themselves? They sort of say, well, I picked this person because it complements the weaknesses that perhaps I have, and I'm hoping that they fulfill that. They complete me, so to speak.
Right. I think that's a great question, and I actually kind of view relationships in sort of two camps in terms of when people, come for coaching. There are sort of the unconscious relationships where I think it's very much what you just said, where people are looking for relationships to fill these empty places within them, to fix problems, to solve their loneliness. And, I can say from the get-go, if that's what a person is going into a relationship for, it may serve a purpose for a short while, and then eventually the reality of the fact that we're going empty and looking to get stuff as opposed to give stuff the well will run dry. And then there are the types of relationships where people do see them as growth opportunities and expansion opportunities. They have a kind of a 20,000 view perspective where it's really one of the most incredible venues for fulfillment and development through giving and expressing who you are and sharing and learning from the catalyst that the other person is. And then those are much more conscious relationships that, people can bring a whole other dimension to and experience things that are just not possible, if you're not in a relationship.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure, Sonia, when you take a look at the age perspective, that when you look at relationships in 20 and 30-year-olds versus people who are in midlife and older, do you see differences between the motivations of what they're looking for?
Oh, there's so many factors. Definitely there are factors between kind of the generational piece, and not always, but by and large there's a certain level of life experience and maturity that will really kind of enrich somebody who's, 40s, 50s in terms of what they're looking for and what they expect from relationships than somebody who's in their 20s, so, younger or even a little bit older than that. So there's definitely, I think, significant differences.
Mm-hmm. Now, talk about your approach when it comes to helping people, I guess, manifest a good relationship or something that they're looking for. It isn't just the basic, I'm sure, biological things and then, the emotional fulfilling things, but I think you go a lot deeper. I mean, you deal with the law of attraction, but talk about how what you do could be different from what you typically see as far as relationship coaching and books that may be out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I am, a trained counselor, so I definitely, and I've studied relationships. It's actually one of my passions. I just wrote an article, and I started off saying, if I've said it once, I've said it a million times. I'm a relationship junkie. I'm fascinated by relationships. So I definitely have the training and the experience and the fascination from a very real-world nuts and bolts perspective. I'm particularly interested in the dynamics between men and women. However, I also am spiritually and energetically oriented, and so I love to bring in that perspective and that angle that everything is energy, our thoughts, our emotions, everything, our relationships. And so what can happen from a more traditional point of view is people can read books on relationships, male-female, family dynamics, and they may even start to feel like they're getting some good tools, some good nuts and bolts about what works and what doesn't. But if you're not really looking at your energy, your consciousness, what you're bringing to the table in a relationship, you could do everything, quote-unquote, right, really look at a book or a training manual or something like a set of rules and not get the results you're looking for because the place you're coming from within yourself, energetically, emotionally, mentally, is at a really, counterproductive perspective. And so I really like to look at things not just from the relationship level, but from a higher perspective where you get to look at what energy are you bringing, what are your expectations, how are you relating to your own emotions to the other person's emotions, and then you really are empowered at a whole nother level to really start to discover what's really possible in relationships when you have that additional perspective.
Mm-hmm. Sonia, you brought something up that I'm thinking I can't help but ask, and that is messages that we tend to get from the outside world about what the ideal relationships are as far as the right elixir. And what comes to mind for me are shows like The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't watched The Bachelor or The Bachelorette in a long time, so I don't know that I'm equipped to actually answer.
I don't either, but I've caught it, and for instance, I'll give you an idea. One that really sticks to mind, I was at a restaurant years ago, and what was funny was I guess this was the final episode of The Bachelorette, okay? And so here's this girl basically dressed like, I don't know, Cinderella, for instance, and she's with this guy. Apparently she chose him as the one. They're standing on this lawn in front of what looks like almost the White House. And they're just, panned in on this, and she's just professing all this love and blah, 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 blah. And the guy's just as, well, for me, almost as dumb as a bag of hammers. Apparently that's what guys look like when they're trying to profess their side of how they feel about love. But, I was watching, like, some of the female servers there, and they're just eating this stuff up. And I'm like, are you kidding me? You actually think this is real? What happens the next day and the next day and the next day? But I guess that's the kind of thing that I'm looking at is that sort of message, it literally throws that Cinderella sort of attitude, let's live happily ever after, but the fact that she gets the chance for, 15 men that vie for her with the guy, it's 15 girls. And you think, I don't know, just the message about something like that.
Yeah, well, you bring up a really great point, and I'll tell you, I fell victim to the media and the expectations that puts forth in people's mind when I was young. For better or for worse, I had a childhood in high school where I would come home and watch soap operas. And for a long time, between the fairy tales growing up and the soap operas, I had this really really distorted view of relationships. So much so that when I graduated from college, I started seeing a woman who called herself a community yentl, and I really delved into a body of work. She said, look, I've got this 3-day retreat on having successful relationships with men. Would you be interested? I said, if someone can teach me how to have a successful relationship with a man, I'll pay them for it. And that began a 10-year journey of not only really like understanding the reality of relationships and really what's at stake, but to really unlearn this like brainwashing that came from TV and the media. And there's just, the truth is that a lot of what's just pop culture isn't going to put forth, the deeper truth about what relationships are really about.
Mm-hmm. Now, talk about what you explore when it comes to finding this truth, as you talk about, in relationships and really what they are, what we can expect or maybe not expect.
Well, I find that the people I work with are people who are probably, what we just talked about, people who've been wanting relationships, wanting some kind of success or experiencing some kind of discontent, and they've gone to their friends, maybe they've even gone to counselors, but they're just not able to kind of break through into a deeper understanding. And so I like to start at the kind of the bigger perspective about and this is not traditional. This is an energetic, spiritually oriented perspective, but it really lays a foundation for something that's very, very helpful in starting to experience fulfillment. And so one of those things is if you're willing to embrace the idea that there's really everything is energy and that there's really only one energy expressing through everything, and that the nature of that energy is love and wholeness. From that realm, it means that there's only one. But then we drop down into this physical experience and we have men and women or two people. So there's this illusion of separation. What happens at the human level is we feel separate. That's just part of the human experience. So we go to relationships to, let's say, feel loved, experience fun, passion, connection, understanding, being heard, feeling this feeling of loneliness. Mm-hmm. But if you really connect with the truth of who you are, which is that your true nature is wholeness, is love, is freedom, is joy, you start to understand that in order to have love, joy, freedom, and all the good stuff in a relationship, you can't actually be lonely, separate, unhappy, bring that to a relationship and have that person fill that need, because, the energy of who you're being is just going to give you back more of that. But if you start to ask yourself and develop a relationship with yourself and with this higher perspective of, so maybe I already am love, I already am freedom, I already am enough. How do I connect with those feelings? How do I start to practice bringing that to my relationships? One of the premises that we teach at Success for the Soul is, and this is very common in manifestation circles and law of attraction circles, is where the attention goes, however you're directing your attention, the energy flows. Mm-hmm. So if you're focused on lack and separation and loneliness, that's your attention. You're going to have more of that. It doesn't matter what you do or where you go, what kind of relationship. But if you look at, if your attention's about how am I already whole, how am I already loved, how can I connect with that within myself, you bring that to a relationship, you can start to experience that in this physical realm where you have this illusion, so to speak, of two separate people when the truth is you're really one. So it can be a big leap for some people to make that kind of a shift. I'm trying to fit a pretty meaty topic into just a few minutes, but when you shift that perspective of I am already everything that I want in a relationship, how do I connect with that, how do I bring it, then your relationships reflect that. And then everything starts to shift in terms of what you can experience in a relationship.
Yeah, it sure is crazy, too, when you see certain relationships with people and you go, well, how's that working for you? He seems kind of needy, never wants to kind of let you go, or you hear about these predatory relationships, or, there's just this whole gamut of neediness, so to speak, and you think, how do people get themselves caught up into that?
Yeah.
Crazy
I think
stuff.
that there's a lot of people confuse being alone with being lonely.
Right. Okay.
And there's a big there's tremendous value in, first of all, understanding that they're two different things. Being alone is an opportunity to cultivate a relationship with yourself. And if you have a solid relationship with yourself, if you are connected to your emotions, your perspective, you learn how to fill yourself up, I always say all of your relationships are simply going to be a mirror reflection of your relationship with yourself. So if you're internally needy, lonely, empty, and separate, all of your relationships are going to eventually reflect that sooner or later. But if you have a relationship with yourself that's about, self-nourishment and fulfillment, then it's not that you can't get your needs met through relationship, but you're actually coming to relationships with how do I share with rather than how do I get from. Mm-hmm. And that's a big distinction. That makes a big difference.
Yeah, I know when you brought that up, the difference between the two of being alone and being lonely is some years ago I had the opportunity to interview with Barbara Feldon, and she is best known for her work in Get Smart as Agent 99.
Oh, yeah.
And she wrote a marvelous book about being alone or being single and staying that way. And she was probably in her late 60s at the time that I interviewed her, and she had produced this book that was talking about the benefits of what it is to be single, and if this is a choice that you want to make, hey, this is great, and went on to talk about some of the things that you're talking about as well, that, you can have partners, to go and do things with and the like, and that you find friends with common interests, but for the most part, you're living alone and you're enjoying life just as if, you were one of these people that maybe wanted to share things with in a relationship. And I thought, well, that's a tremendous amount of balance, that you're taking a look there. So, having a relationship can be something that you enjoy, another person to share things with, but it's not as totally necessary. And I think sometimes, or a lot of times when I listen to people, when it comes to relationships, it's like it's something they feel they have to do. It's sort of like, maybe in America, and I can't say this for the rest of the world, like having children is just something we're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so, very much so. As a matter of fact, and because we have these like societal expectations or these these ideas that we don't even question, we find ourselves in the midst of them, and then we're like, wait a minute, why am I not happy? And one of the things I think there's probably not a single human being who hasn't had the experience of, we think that if we're in a relationship, we're not going to be lonely. Sometimes we are the most lonely in a relationship. Why? Because it has nothing to do with the other person. It's because we're lonely in our relationship with ourselves or with Source or, that deeper aspect of, that it's all about your relationship with yourself always.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, I kind of wonder about that as people are listening and they may be in a relationship and perhaps they may feel that they're doing what they can, but things just aren't really working out at that moment. How much of it is really our stuff, and then, how much of it is it somebody else's, so to speak? Because, I see where you're talking about the ideal that relationships are a reflection or a mirror of ourselves. But sometimes you have to ask yourself, is what in your life, is that really a reflection of me, or did this randomly come along, and is it them, so to speak?
Right. Well, that's a great question, and I think that's a question that we always have to ask. So there's no cookie-cutter answer to is it me or is it them, but I can share the way I like to approach it so that you can get to the answer, which is whenever you're struggling with anything in a relationship, the place to start is your relationship with yourself.
Okay.
What most people do is when there's a problem, they point their finger at the other person. You need to change. You're not doing this. I'm lonely. We need to go do more stuff. You. Well, it might be them, but it might be you. So the way to find out is go back to self and start to ask yourself, okay, what are all the things that I'm blaming that person for? What are all the things I'm trying to get from that person? Now, if I take that person out of the equation, let's say, for example, you're saying you don't pay enough attention to me. So that may be true, or it may be that they're just reflecting something. You should say, okay, so I'm blaming them for you're not giving me enough attention. Let's be honest. Do I give myself enough attention? Do I take time to do the things that make me happy? Do I make myself a priority, or do I put everybody else's needs ahead of me? We look at, what's the reality in your relationship with self, and first, do some work there. Once you start to really do some work there and take responsibility, then see what happens in your relationship. Many times from an energetic point of view, when you shift in your relationship with yourself, there's really only two things that can happen. either that person will seemingly miraculously change and start giving you all this attention because they were really just reflecting you, or that relationship could eventually leave your life. It could just kind of dissolve because really you're now operating from a place of, I am worthy of love and attention. I'm going to give it to myself, and therefore my relationships are going to reflect that. So it's either going to transform the relationships you have, or the ones that can't rise up to meet that will disappear.
Mm-hmm. What about making relationships work out? Sometimes I think that people, they perhaps may try too hard, or it gets to a point where you should just, kind of move in a different direction. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm a big believer in, assuming we're talking about long-term committed relationships, the philosophy of having no regrets. If you're in a committed relationship, if you have an ideal, if you believe in the possibility of relationships being something that contributes to your evolution and expansion, it is very common, especially in our culture, in our society. There's so many reasons for it where if we're bumping up against something, we will consider quitting on it maybe a little sooner than serves everything that you want in the relationship. And so I believe strongly in if you really want to find out what this relationship is made of, leave no stone unturned and make sure you have no regrets so that if it doesn't work out, you can have that certainty of I tried everything I could. But it happens oftentimes that people bump something that feels bump up against something that feels insurmountable. They don't have the answers. They can't make it work out. They go, you know what, I'm out of here. And guess what? Wherever you go, there you are. If it was something within you, you're going to experience that again in another relationship. So,
right.
So that's kind of how I look at making relationships work, really just making sure you have no regrets.
I had an image years ago. I had a fifth-grade teacher that kept saying something that was very wise when you were talking about blaming and, how we tend to think, it's you. You're the reason of the problem, and you're pointing your fingers. And he simply said that whenever you point your finger at someone or outside of yourself to blame something on, whatever's happening, you have to remember you have three fingers pointing back at yourself.
Yeah, I love it. That's
and
good.
as a fifth grade, you don't see the wisdom right away, but you say, hey, there might be something there. And then as the years went by, I thought, there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is it like? Do you ever actually do coaching where you actually work with groups?
Well, the groups that I've been working with, I haven't done male-female joint groups for relationships, but I have been working extensively with women for many years. And
so men are just a little timid about walking through that door and kicking off their shoes and getting comfortable, or?
I'm sorry, say that again.
I was saying, so it sounds like men are a little uncomfortable, kicking off their shoes and coming in as a group and talking about relationships.
Oh, no, not at all. But I'll tell you honestly, the reason I haven't yet, it's funny, I just did a talk at the Body, Mind, Spirit Expo in Portland a couple months ago. And I had a talk, and it was called what it really takes to create successful relationships with men for the spiritual, energy-minded woman. And it was really focused on women. And the reason I focus on women is because even though we start from 20,000-foot view of the energy and source and your relationship with self, once we get, it kind of comes down into the earthly realm of men and women. And I realize I'm not covering all relationships, but for the relationships where a woman would like to experience her feminine energy and have a masculine energy man, there's a lot to be said for understanding masculine and feminine energy. So I just really wanted to focus on that. Well, I had a whole bunch of men came in, plopped themselves down, and they wanted to listen to this talk. And I do get quite a few men write on my blog and are very interested and responsive. And the reason I haven't yet delved into that is this is my own thing. There are things about being a man that I could never teach a man. They can only learn it from men. But we can offer the feminine perspective, and so I just haven't gotten there in my curriculums yet. But there's a lot of interest there for men.
I just kind of wondered because I have been to sort of, I guess, group coaching, and it's interesting when you get to certain aspects of what the facilitator is getting us to want to do, and I wondered, what elements when you introduce them to the group tend to make them squirm a little bit, I guess is what I was looking for there. And do you find that it's fairly common within groups when you say, okay, this is what we're going to talk about or work on maybe at this moment. You kind of watch them fidget like you just know this is going to be a realm that takes them out of their comfort zone, so to speak.
Yes, well, although I haven't facilitated, I've participated in a lot of group work and a lot of groups with men and women together. And, there's just something so powerful. It's both powerful and makes people squirm when you have men and women in the same room who are committed to discovering, to really learning, about, how they operate, how they work, how they're wired, and what it's going to take to make things, to be successful. And the beautiful thing about these group dynamics, even though they can feel intimate and exposing and revealing, is you can start to really let in information. Let's say a woman can really see men in a whole new light that she just couldn't see in just when she was caught up in her own dynamic with one guy.
Right.
All of a sudden, there's just you're kind of like a third-party viewer, and it's like, oh my gosh, they're saying the same thing my guy's been telling me for 5 years, and I didn't believe him, but it's true, and vice versa. So I think the intimacy exposure element is kind of makes people squirm, but I think people are hungry for it too.
And I like that you use the word exposure, because when you think of this group dynamic that I was suggesting, I think a lot of times, and certainly you're the the relationship expert and coach here, so certainly let me know if we're on the right track here. But the idea of vulnerability, a lot of times we tend to keep that, if you want to call it, skeleton in the closet. And also when you think if we want to bring that truth about ourselves out, those hidden truths, those dark places that sometimes in relationships come out, that a lot of times you start seeing the fights that may arise, and then they kind of use that against the other person. And it's just pretty devastating to say, well, in a relationship, we should be sharing the whole of ourselves, but at the same time, you're going to take some of that whole and you're going to start beating me with it.
Right.
And, how you kind of work with that, I guess, because I think being vulnerable is, I believe, what scares people the most. Right. And anyway, your thoughts on that?
That's a great point. I actually just wrote an article just the other day, went out in my newsletter, because I'm teaching a class right now with an intimate group of women who are dedicated to transforming their relationships with men. And as I was pondering this after literally more than 2 decades of immersing myself in my relationship junkie addiction of studying this stuff, I asked myself, I said, so, Sonia, after everything that you've studied, what's like the single most important factor into having successful relationships with men? And what surprised me, the answer that came up surprised me, because it wasn't love, communication, commitment, patience, faith. It was actually courage.
Right.
And it's because of that vulnerability factor that you're talking about. The only way to really have the kinds of relationships that most of us want, which is that deep connection, that ability to, you love me for exactly who I am. You accept me, and vice versa. I accept and love you. Nobody's perfect, and I feel heard. I feel seen. I feel understood. I feel supported. And that reciprocity, you can't have that without creating a place, an environment where it's safe to be all of who you are. And yet that's one of the most terrifying things for people, for the very reason that you shared, which is, if I share who I am, will you take care of this, or will you use it against me? And one of the things that I think needs to happen to be able to delve into that is there's a certain amount of understanding or work for each person in a dynamic to really decide to get to understand, are your needs more important, or are the relationship's needs more important? Because we start to use those pieces of information against each other when our own needs become more important than the needs of the relationship. But when the needs of the relationship, when we say, I'm committed to this relationship succeeding, which means I need to take your feelings into account just as much as mine. If you just said something that scared me or hurt my feelings, rather than lash out, is this going to serve the relationship, or do I need to find a way to hold that with respect and regard and learn how to take care of my needs while I'm taking care of yours, rather than it's, either my needs or your needs, which immediately dissolves, the fabric of the relationship. So you bring up a really good point, and that's why, relationships, these superficial presentations in the media, really do a disservice to people who really want to have successful relationships, because it takes some some work. It takes some depth.
Well, not to mention when you think about that as well is that we tend to use the happily ever after scenario in a lot of the other areas of our lives, and you see that it just doesn't work well because life is just not like that. Life is chaos like the universe.
Yep. I have a coach. I love her phrase. She goes, and it is all areas of life. It's the myth of arrival. It's like a happily ever after. Like, if I just do everything right and I get married, and then it is happily ever after. And there's no arrival. There's no there. Life is a journey, and part of that journey includes allowing all of life in, not just the good stuff. And if you're not prepared to let in the stuff that's uncomfortable, if you're not prepared to look at it like life is a journey, then as soon as something challenging arises, then you're completely disillusioned. But the truth is that happily ever after is not contingent upon everything happening the way you want. It's much more about, okay, life happens. How am I going to relate to it? You can relate to it in a powerful way where you can experience sort of a happily ever after. But happily ever after isn't because everything looks perfect, but it's because you trust yourself and have developed the skill to navigate whatever comes your way in a relationship. And it becomes a character-building, relationship-deepening journey as opposed to an arrival point, a destination, and then you're done.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking of a friend of mine years ago. She seemed a little busted up throughout her life and decided to find God and go to church on Sundays. And a couple of months down the road, she says, I'm going to church every Sunday, but I just don't find that I'm any happier. And I said, really? So you believe that going to church regularly was going to give you some sort of permanent happiness? And she says, I really don't know what I think. And I said, well, you're going to find a lot of confusion when you look outside of yourself for what it is that you're seeking. And so just think on that for a minute. I don't know that we've ever talked about that sense because I haven't seen her for, probably not too shortly after that time. But, that idea that we're thinking that once these certain things are in place, as you were just saying, and this is in relationships and I think in every other area of our lives, that all of a sudden life is just supposed to stay easy, and that's just not what happens. It becomes easier when you, I guess, roll with the punches, for lack of a better word.
Right. Well, a lot of, what I like to help people do is redefine success. The success for the soul is not about success for the small you that wants to just have everything perfect and lined up. It's for the soul, success for your soul, and that's about redefining success. And success is not like I've got all my ducks lined up and everything is perfect and now I'm happy and I'll never have to worry again, because in that kind of paradigm, what you're saying is there are good things in life and there are bad things in life. And the definition of success is when I have all the good things and I never feel bad, then I'll be successful, which means you're going to be miserable because you can't get there. That doesn't exist. And there's also this element of judging. You judge things as good, you judge things as bad. And as long as there's good stuff and bad stuff, you're always going to be resisting a part of life. However, when you say, you know what, all of it is life, and if I can learn to suspend judgment and see if not the beauty, the opportunity, the blessing in everything, then not to get too scriptural because I like the phrase, but it's not because I'm religious-based, but I'm more spiritually based, but then we can be in this world and not of it, which means that the things that we used to judge as good, the things that we used to judge as bad, are all part of the experience. You can enjoy all of life because you can see beauty even in the chaos. You can see beauty and experience beauty even in the anguish, and your mood is not contingent upon what life looks like. But that's a huge paradigm shift for people. And
a lot of times, too, when we talk about these bad things that happen, and this even includes relationships, if we're willing to go into that, from what I've been hearing you say, is that a lot of times your answers are right there, and they're a lot easier than you think they are. Would that be true?
Absolutely. One of the things that I've been practicing this for a long time, but more so than ever, is the opportunity to, when you're confronted with something that challenges you, you always have a choice. You can either contract into this, from fear, pull away from it, and therefore reinforce the smaller version of you, or you can lean into it. And when you lean into it, what your whole being is actually saying to the universe is, that which I fear is not real. And that which you fear starts to dissolve because you're being a bigger version of you. You don't know what's on the other side of leaning into that, but you're sure going to get to find out. And in the process, you're probably going to find out that the thing you feared wasn't what you thought. And so you can actually be free of that thing that's been controlling you, that you've been trying to, what you resist persists, that you've been pushing away. And that's the heart of intimacy. Intimacy is when two people come together, and it's easy to be intimate when you feel safe, and there's nothing challenging you. But when there's something coming up in a relationship that scares you, or you think, oh no, if they see this part of me now, that's it. That's when they laugh at me. That's when they reject me. That's when they run away. That's when they turn a deaf ear, and I feel unheard. And in that moment, you can either retract and make that relationship about protecting yourself. It's all about you. Or you can lean into it and say, I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to lean into this. I'm going to share a vulnerability. And, well, I guess I'll find out there's no guarantee, but you'll find out what you're made of, what the relationship's made of, what your partner is made of, and it'll be an opportunity. And many times you'll be surprised in a good way.
And Sonia, as well, that if you lean into it, at least there's certainty. Versus, well, I think. Well, how's that working for you?
Right. And that goes back to the courage. Leaning into it takes courage. And
right.
It's not like some of the courage, you do it once and you're done. It's a way of life.
Mm-hmm.
You have to, you practice courage. But, again, that's the juice of relationships. Then wow, how rich is that, to keep becoming more courageous and bigger and better and dissolving your fears because you keep summoning courage and leaning into it and knowing for sure rather than always just wondering.
Fascinating stuff. Sonia, if you could, for our listeners, why don't you go ahead and give out your website information where they can find out more?
Okay, I'd be happy to. So lots of free resources, tools, articles, tips. It's successforthesoul.com. That's all one word, and that's successforthesoul.com. And I did want to share, for people who are interested in going deeper with this juicy relationship stuff, I'm doing a free class by telephone on Monday the 18th at 4 p.m. Pacific time. And to learn more about that, you can just go to the website, but you can actually go straight to the information page. It's successforthesoul.com/recreate your relationships. And that's recreate-your-relationships. It's a free class. We do a monthly teleclass series. And if you can't make it live, we'll send you the audio.
And remember, there is no happily ever after, but you can sure feel pretty good about the rest of it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Sonia, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Always a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Daniel.
You betcha. We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Remember, the website is Success for the Soul, is where you're going to find out about all this and find out how you can take the next step with the hero's journey. Have some courage to discover what that is, and who knows, you'll find that person that's willing to take that adventure with you. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past.